For 8 years, my life had moved at the rhythm of predictability. Mornings started with the smell of brewed coffee, the hum of Mark's razor, the small chatter about bills or dinner plans. Our house was modest but warm, cream-colored walls that held the echoes of laughter from our early years, and the faint scratches on the kitchen table that reminded me of rushed breakfasts and clumsy spills. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It was steady. It was safe. Mark and I had settled into a kind of routine that seemed almost rehearsed, as though we were actors repeating the same lines in a play we'd long since memorized. He worked long hours, came home tired, and sometimes fell asleep in front of the TV with his shoes still on. I filled the spaces between with small comforts: gardening, weekend runs, dinner with friends every now and then. Nothing dramatic, nothing disruptive. That life might have stretched on without interruption, if not for the house next door. It had been empty for almost a year, its shutters weathered, its garden overrun with weeds. One afternoon, I noticed a moving truck parked in the driveway. Boxes stacked on the lawn, furniture wrapped in blankets, a man directing the process with a calm efficiency. He was tall, lean, with the kind of posture that suggested both weariness and resilience. Later, I learned his name was Logan. When we met, it was nothing more than neighborly courtesy. I walked over with a smile, welcomed him, commented on the renovations. He responded with warmth, his voice carrying that easy confidence of someone used to starting over. He spoke of plans, painting, fixing, restoring, and I nodded, intrigued more than I wanted to admit. But what unsettled me wasn't the conversation. It was the way his eyes lingered, just a fraction longer than politeness required. A pause, a wait, a flicker of something unspoken. I went back to my house afterward, closing the door on the familiar smell of lemon cleaner and dinner in the oven. Yet a part of me stayed on that lawn, replaying the meeting, turning over the subtle current I had felt. I told myself it was nothing, just a neighbor moving in, just another ordinary day in an ordinary life. But in the quiet of that evening, as Mark mumbled about work while scrolling through his phone, I couldn't shake the strange awareness that something had shifted. Like a thread pulled loose from a tightly woven fabric, a small unraveling had begun. I didn't know it then, but the rhythm of predictability, the safe, steady life I had built, was about to crack open. In the days that followed, Logan's presence seemed to thread itself into the fabric of my routine. At first, it was coincidence. I'd see him outside, pruning shrubs or hauling planks of wood to the garage. I'd wave politely, and he'd smile back, the kind of smile that felt warmer than it had any right to be. But then the coincidences began to feel like patterns. During my morning runs, I'd catch sight of him standing by the fence, sipping coffee from a dark mug. He'd raise it in greeting, his eyes following me just long enough that I felt the burn of attention more than the strain in my legs. In the evenings, when I watered the flowers or brought in the mail, he'd be there again, leaning casually on his porch railing as though the timing had been rehearsed. Our conversations grew from short exchanges into something softer, something edged with curiosity. He'd ask about the neighborhood, about the best cafe nearby, about my garden. I answered easily, maybe too easily, enjoying the way his questions lingered on me rather than skimming past, as they so often did with Mark. With Logan, there was a sense of being seen, not in a grand, sweeping way, but in the small, piercing moments that slip past defenses. Mark, meanwhile, carried on with his rhythm of work, chores, and sleep. He was dependable, steady, and at times distant in the way only familiarity can breed. He asked about dinner, not about me. He noticed the laundry folded on the couch, not the new dress I wore. I knew he loved me. His way of showing it was in the house repairs, the bills paid, the loyalty he wore like armor. But it was a love built on routine, not discovery. And then there was Logan, with his half-finished rooms and unspoken stories, standing as a contrast to everything my life had been. He carried the air of someone who had seen loss, endured change, and yet still looked at the world with a restless hunger. It was intoxicating, even if I wouldn't admit it out loud. I told myself it was harmless, that the lingering glances were nothing more than neighborly friendliness. But when I caught myself anticipating the sound of his footsteps outside, or glancing toward the fence as I sipped my own coffee, I knew I was lying. Something had started to grow, something both delicate and dangerous. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even desire, not fully formed. It was possibility. And once you taste possibility, even in the quietest corners of your life, the ordinary begins to feel suffocating. It was a Saturday morning when the line between neighborly exchanges and something more finally blurred. Logan had been working outside again, sanding a weathered bench, sawdust clinging to his shirt. I stopped to comment on the progress, and before I could retreat back into my safe orbit, he suggested coffee. His tone was casual, but beneath it, I felt the gravity of an invitation that meant more than caffeine and conversation. I told myself it was innocent, just two neighbors sharing a cup, nothing to confess to Mark later. Still, the moment I stepped into Logan's kitchen, I felt the shift. His house smelled of fresh paint and wood shavings, a place in transition, alive with possibility. Unlike my home, where everything was already settled, each object here seemed chosen with intention, carrying the weight of reinvention. We sat at a small table, steaming mugs between us, and our words came easier than I expected. Logan spoke about his divorce, about the cracks that widened until love turned into silence. He didn't cast himself as a victim. He owned his mistakes, admitted his pride, the times he'd chosen distance instead of closeness. There was something raw in the way he told it, unpolished, unafraid. I listened, but beneath his story, I heard my own reflection. The silence between Mark and me, the way routine had dulled not only our conversations, but my sense of self. Logan's words slipped under my skin, unearthing long-buried questions. Had I become invisible in my own life? Had I mistaken stability for happiness? When he suggested, gently, that maybe I craved more than what I had, something adventurous, something that made my blood quicken, I wanted to deny it. But the truth was undeniable, rising like a tide. I had spent years convincing myself that comfort was enough, that longing was childish, even selfish. Yet here was someone daring me to consider otherwise, and the echo of his challenge lingered, even as I tried to suppress it. We didn't touch that day. Nothing scandalous happened. But intimacy has many faces, and sometimes the most dangerous form comes without a single gesture. I left Logan's house with nothing more than the taste of coffee in my mouth, but inside, something had awakened. By the time I returned to my own kitchen, Mark already gone to run errands, I realized the danger wasn't in Logan's confessions. It was in mine, the ones I whispered to myself in silence, that I wanted to feel seen, that I wanted to feel alive, and that, perhaps, I was willing to risk more than I had ever imagined for the chance. It happened on a night that should have been unremarkable. Mark was working late, and the house was wrapped in its usual hush. I told myself I was only going next door for advice. Logan had been renovating a room, and I claimed curiosity about the design. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted to see him, to step out of my routine and into the pull that had been growing between us. His house felt different at night. The soft glow of lamps replaced the harsh daylight that usually revealed dust and paint cans. Music hummed low from a speaker, something soulful and slow. On the table were sketches of layouts, notes scrawled in bold handwriting, and half-finished glasses of wine. It all felt too easy, too natural, as if I belonged there. We talked about walls and windows at first, pretending the conversation was about measurements and color palettes. But laughter slipped in, casual at first, then deeper, carrying an undercurrent neither of us dared name. Every pause between words stretched too long. Every glance felt heavy, weighted with the things we weren't saying. I remember the moment so clearly. He leaned over to show me a sketch, the lines of the page blurred by the closeness of his hand brushing against mine. My breath caught, and for a heartbeat the air seemed to thicken, dense with anticipation. Then he turned toward me, and I didn't step back. The kiss was not dramatic. It was quiet, tentative, but in that silence it roared louder than anything I'd ever felt. His lips on mine were soft yet certain, carrying a hunger that matched the one I'd been burying. I kissed him back, and in that instant, I knew there was no going back. It ended as quickly as it began, both of us pulling away, breathless and startled by the enormity of what we'd done. But the line was crossed, a boundary broken. I could have left then, could have told myself it was a mistake, a momentary lapse. Instead, I stayed. We ate dinner at that table, laughed again, and let the night roll on, as though nothing monumental had occurred. But when I walked back into my own house, the silence felt sharper. The ordinary life I had once called stable now seemed like a shell, fragile and false. I lay awake that night beside Mark, his steady breathing filling the room, and I thought only of Logan's kiss. When Mark announced he'd be gone for a few days on a fishing trip with his colleagues, I felt the words settle in my chest, like a forbidden invitation. I nodded, smiled, wished him well, but inside there was a pulse of anticipation I couldn't silence. It wasn't about fish or rivers. It was about the space his absence created, the open hours, the silence that no longer bound me to loyalty. Logan didn't need to ask twice. The moment Mark's car disappeared down the street, we stepped into a world that felt borrowed, fragile, but intoxicating. It began with mornings spent on his porch, drinking coffee as though the world had shrunk to just us. Then afternoons unfolded like secrets. A hidden pier by the water, where the boards creaked under our weight, an art museum tucked in the city where dim halls made us feel unseen. A cafe, where we lingered over pastries, our knees brushing beneath the table. Every moment carried a dangerous sweetness. At the deserted beach, the one he claimed only locals knew, I stood barefoot in the sand, the tide curling around my ankles. He touched my hand, and the simplicity of it nearly undid me. There, under a sky bruised with sunset, it felt as if I had slipped into a different life, one where I wasn't bound by vows, where guilt didn't cling to my skin, where desire was not something to suppress but to embrace. Logan spoke openly of wanting more. He told me he imagined a future with me, one unchained from secrets and shame. His words were reckless, but they pierced through me, stirring a longing I had tried for years to quiet. With him, I felt not only wanted but alive, as if I had stepped out of a shadow I hadn't known was consuming me, and yet guilt stalked me. Even in those golden hours, even when laughter spilled out of me unrestrained, the thought of Mark's steady devotion pressed against the edges of my joy. I could see his face, hear his voice, and it cut through the illusion like a blade. But I didn't turn back. I couldn't. Those days with Logan felt like a fever dream, dangerous but exhilarating. I convinced myself they were ours alone, sealed away from consequence. I wanted to believe in the illusion, that freedom could be stolen without cost. But illusions always end. And even as I lay in Logan's arms on that last night, I sensed the shadow of reality creeping closer, waiting to break through the fragile glass of our secret world. It ended not with whispers, but with a storm. Mark's fishing trip was supposed to last until Sunday, but on Friday afternoon, I heard the familiar grind of his tires on the driveway. My body went cold before my mind could process it. I was at Logan's, the two of us curled into a life that was never ours to keep. The front door opened, and Mark's voice called out, a sound that should have comforted me, but instead carved dread into my chest. He stepped inside, eyes scanning the scene, and in an instant the truth shattered between us. Logan stood frozen, the weight of exposure heavy on his shoulders. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the floorboards, but there was no escape. Mark's face twisted, not just in anger, but in a kind of devastation I had never seen before. He demanded answers, his words sharp, jagged, breaking in the middle with disbelief. I stumbled through my own, the tears, the apologies, the useless explanations that only deepened the wound. I told him I was lonely, that I felt invisible, that I needed more than routine. But how small those words sounded against the enormity of betrayal. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. It was the silence of a man who realized the life he had built, the trust he had given, had cracked beneath his feet. He didn't slam doors or throw objects. He simply looked at me as though I was a stranger wearing his wife's skin. That look burned more than rage ever could. Back in our house, the confrontation unraveled further. My confessions spilled out, every moment, every secret I could no longer deny. Mark's hands shook, his jaw clenched, his voice cracked between fury and grief. I could see him fighting himself, torn between the desire to throw everything away and the deeper, quieter pull of the years we had shared. In the end, he didn't leave that night. He didn't pack bags or walk out the door. Instead, we sat in a living room littered with silence, the weight of 8 years pressing down on us. The air was heavy with pain, with betrayal, but also with something else. A fragile thread of possibility, a question neither of us dared to voice. Could we salvage what was left? By morning, exhausted and hollow, we came to the first of many decisions. Not to separate immediately, not to destroy what we had with one final strike, but to try, painfully, awkwardly, desperately, to face what had broken and see if it could be repaired. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't love reborn. It was survival, pure and raw. And in that fragile decision, I felt the full gravity of the line I had crossed. Nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks that followed felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. Every step forward was sharp, every attempt at conversation raw with the risk of bleeding. Mark and I lived in the same house, but not in the same space. The air carried his hurt, my guilt, and the unbearable silence of two people who had once loved easily, but now struggled even to look each other in the eye. It was Mark who first suggested therapy. His voice was tired, not angry, when he said we couldn't go on like this. I agreed, because agreeing was all I could do. Sitting across from a stranger in a softly lit room, I felt stripped bare. We spoke truths we had buried for years. My loneliness, his distance, the slow erosion of intimacy that had made me crave attention elsewhere. Mark admitted he had stopped seeing me as a woman and started seeing me only as a fixture of our life. Reliable, constant, but invisible. The process was ugly at times. Arguments spilled out in the car rides home. Tears came in the quiet hours of night. There were moments when I thought he would give up, when I thought I would too. Yet, against all odds, we kept returning. Week after week, we tore at the rot between us, exposing the wounds to air, letting them sting so they might finally heal. Slowly, something shifted. We began talking outside of therapy, late at night when the house was still. Not about chores or bills, but about us. About the people we had been, the people we wanted to become. We forced ourselves to relearn each other, to risk honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. One weekend, we drove to the ocean. The same waves that had once carried my illusions of freedom now carried a different weight. Standing beside Mark on the damp sand, I remembered the early days of our love. The laughter, the dreams, the certainty that we had found something rare. He reached for my hand, hesitant at first, but when our fingers intertwined, it felt like a fragile promise. Forgiveness did not come in a single moment. It unfolded in fragments, in the awkward smiles, in the quiet dinners where conversation felt lighter, in the way his eyes softened when he looked at me again. The scars remained, undeniable and deep, but so did the choice to stay. Paradoxically, it was the breaking that forced us to rebuild, and though our marriage would never again be as seamless as it once seemed, it became something different, more honest, more deliberate, forged not in routine, but in survival. I learned then that love, real love, is not the absence of betrayal or pain. It is the choice to face them, to stay in the ruins and start over. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint but steady pulse of something I thought I had lost. Hope.